I'm walking in one of the defensive ditches of Cholesbury Camp, Hillfort, just outside of Tring in Buckinghamshire. The Chiltern Hills has one of the densest concentrations of hillforts like this in all of the United Kingdom. There are more than 20 along the Chalk Ridge. Sites like these were constructed anywhere from the late Bronze Age, which is about 1050 BC, right the way through to around 300 BC. There would have been a lot of activity here in the Bronze Age, and we found some evidence in the form of stone axes. But the actual building of the Hillfort probably began somewhere around 500 BC. The construction of these earthworks would have taken a lot of work, and so people, men, women and children perhaps, would have come together either seasonally or over the course of several months to dig this ditch and to build the earthworks. I'm stood now between two large earthwork ramparts, and these would have been constructed by people digging this ditch out and throwing up the arisings to create these huge banks. Now, over the last 2,000 years, this ditch has silted up from the erosion of those ramparts, which means where I'm stood now is about a metre higher than it should have been. This ditch would have been about a metre and a half deeper, and the ramparts at least a metre higher. The trees we see now on the earthworks of Cholesbury Camp, Hillfort are a relatively modern feature, probably planted somewhere in the last 150 years. In the Iron Age, the earthworks would have been completely bare of trees, and indeed the only structure that would have been on the earthwork probably was a fence, a palisade. From the late Bronze Age through to the end of the Iron Age, right the way across Europe, hillforts are constructed for a variety of reasons: for defence, for ritual purposes, sometimes as a communal status symbol, which expresses the community's resources and strength and ownership of the area, perhaps. The thing is, we don't really know why an individual hillfort was constructed. With no written records, it's a bit of guesswork, but we try to fit the best evidence as possible to make up a good story. If you were to fly over Cholesbury Camp in a plane, you might notice a ring of trees from above, and that would tell you where the hillfort was, but it wouldn't give you very much detail about where the earthworks are and where the archaeology is. So we use a technique called LiDAR, which allows us to use laser scanning to remove the trees from a digital model that we create. The Beacons of the Past project, funded by National Lottery, produced a LiDAR survey of the entire Chilterns, and the results for Cholesbury Camp have provided us with a very detailed look at the ditches and banks that make up this hillfort. Having now come up over the ramparts and into the interior of the hillfort, possibly through what might have been the original entrance, we're not left with much to look at. There's very little in the way of upstanding archaeology that could suggest to us how this hillfort was used. Everything lies buried underneath the soil. LiDAR can't help us here to understand what went on inside the hillfort, because LiDAR just shows us the humps and bumps in the ground underneath the trees. The reason we know a little bit about what people might have been doing inside the hillfort is thanks to some 1930s excavations done by a man called Day Kimball. He discovered several Iron Age hearths and furnaces which would have been used for producing iron. Iron production leaves in the ground not only patches of burning, which suggest where they've been heating the ore, but also all the impurities which roll out as a thing called slag. And pieces like this were found during the excavation, suggesting that that's exactly what was going on here. This would have been an excellent spot for producing iron, because although the ramparts themselves weren't covered in trees, there would have been many stands of managed woodland nearby. And in order to smelt iron, you need a lot of charcoal, and for charcoal, you need a lot of timber. So wood would have been cut down and then turned into charcoal, and then brought here into the hillfort for the production of iron. It's much easier to move your iron ore to the charcoal than to move tons of charcoal to where your iron is. The other technique used for finding out what's under the soil, geophysical survey, has been done here in the year 2000 and again in 2022. These geophysical surveys detected some indication of roundhouses within the hillfort. A lot of times we think of roundhouses as being part of permanent settlement or a mini town inside of a hillfort, and for some hillforts that might have been true. But here the roundhouses seem to be scattered along the edge, the eastern edge of the hillfort, and possibly a few at the western edge. This suggests, possibly, that these provided seasonal shelter for the people who are actually working the iron production within the hillfort, rather than people living here full time. A big question people often ask about hillforts is, where did they get water? Water would have been key to producing iron as well. Here we have what's called a dew pond. And although we don't know the exact date of it, it's very likely that this pond was still here in the Iron Age. This is one of two ponds here in Cholesbury Hillfort, which you can see on the LiDAR as dark indentations. The ponds would have collected rainwater and stored it until needed for iron production or possibly even for watering stock. One way to answer that question of how old this pond is would be to take a core sample through the sediments that have built up over thousands of years. A project that the Conservation Board is hoping to launch in the next couple of years may answer exactly that question. So the people making iron here and living in the countryside around Cholesbury Hillfort probably lived their lives very much in the same way for hundreds of years. But by the end of the 1st century, things were beginning to change, and we see that there's no real activity here into the Roman period. The excavations didn't show any Roman pottery, which is quite unusual if there had been activity in that later period. In fact, iron production seems to move down the road to nearby Cow Roast, where we know for several centuries the late Iron Age and Roman production of iron continues on at an industrial scale. So what happened here at the camp? Well, it went out of use for a very long time and was probably just used as stock enclosure. By the Saxon period, we know that it is referred to as an individual's farm, Cholesbury, which is where the name Cholesbury eventually comes from. And by the 1600s, there's a manor built into the side of the Hillfort. Later on, then there is the church construction. And behind me, you see the Church of St. Lawrence, which is coincidentally one of two churches inside Hillforts in the Chilterns, and both called St. Lawrence. You can find the other one at West Wickham Camp. If you want to know more about the Hillforts of the Chilterns, you can visit the Chilterns Conservation Board website. There you will find detailed maps, more information, and a page for each Hillfort.